This is Brother Peter Diamond, vaticancatholic.com, and I was going to be doing a series called Refuting Baptism of Desire. Our book, which is available on and from our website, Outside the Catholic Church, There is Absolutely No Salvation, covers this issue in much depth. It answers the objections that are raised, covers the history, and we encourage people to look at that. But it's very important to focus on some of the main arguments that people raise on this issue. Let's talk about the necessity of baptism, address this with new emphasis and new points. And so I'm going to be focusing on the necessity of water baptism and refuting baptism of desire and some of the main issues at stake in this debate. And what I want to talk about right now is the issue of danger of death. There are some very interesting things to consider when we look at this issue in more detail. And an important point recently struck me. Both those who are in favor of baptism of desire and those who are against it admit that unbaptized catechumens, that is, individuals who are undergoing preparation or instruction for the sacrament of baptism, should be baptized in any necessity or danger of death. So in other words, even those who theoretically believe that it's possible for an unbaptized catechumen who desires water baptism to be saved without the sacrament of baptism will agree that if there's any danger of death, such as you're on a ship which might be destroyed, or someone's coming to raid your village and might kill you and the people around you, that unbaptized catechumens should be baptized in that necessity, and that's what the Church has always done. Even historically, for those people who believed in the concept of explicit baptism of desire, they would still baptize the unbaptized catechumen if any situation were to arise in which there were real danger. And I want to give a few quotes from the life of St. John de Brebeuf, who clearly believed that no man can be saved without baptism, which illustrates this traditional practice. On page 278 of Saint Among the Hurons, we read of one of his fellow missionaries, Father Daniel, and when there was a real threat that their village was going to be stormed and attacked, we read that, quote, Father Daniel gathered the Christians in his chapel and pronounced the absolution over them. He conferred baptism hurriedly on the catechumens, and even on the pagans, who screamed that they, quote, feared hell more than death. We actually go on to read that the scare passed when some hours later it was discovered that the alarm was false. And so they didn't even die, but because they feared that they would or might die, all the catechumens were baptized. The pagans were apparently hurriedly instructed in the basic mysteries and then baptized, because it was believed that that's what needed to be done. They couldn't be left without baptism. Now this presents an interesting problem for the concept of baptism of desire if we think about it logically. That's because there's only one baptism, and when someone is baptized, that person must be committed to lead a Christian life in accordance with the commandments. And that was a real concern because, for example, on page 207 of the same book, we read that St. John de Brebeuf baptized one native in danger of death, who was actually miraculously cured and went on to live, and for a short time boasted that he was a believer, but a short time after that returned to his pagan orgies, in other words, his diabolical rituals and rites. And so he conferred baptism on him hastily instructed him because he thought he would die, but this individual obviously didn't have the firm commitment and went back to his paganism. And so if that person isn't ready and is baptized and falls into sin, it's going to be detrimental, obviously, and that person can't do it again. So if the concept of baptism of desire is legitimate, it isn't, but let's just say for the sake of argument that it is, why do they baptize them at all in danger of death? Many of these unbaptized catechumens clearly had not demonstrated the commitment to lead a Christian life which the missionaries normally would have required before they would have conferred baptism in cases outside danger of death. So why did they baptize them? Logically, they shouldn't baptize them. Rather, they should have made sure to tell the natives to be sincere in their desire. For if that's an efficacious means of salvation, then those who were truly sincere and wanted baptism would have been, quote, justified by the desire, and then, if the danger passed, they could have still undergone instruction, demonstrated their commitment, and then been baptized later on. But by hastily conferring baptism on them, you're not only running the risk that they might not be sincere, but you're eliminating the possibility that they could ever be instructed and demonstrate the commitment that you want to see prior to baptism, because once they're baptized, it can never be done again. And so the fact that it's always been done in any danger of death for the unbaptized catechumen shows that even among people who believe in the false idea of baptism of desire, they have a doubt about its legitimacy. They feel it's more important to make sure that person is baptized than to run the risk that he's not sincere and will just return to his heresies or permanently hamper his ability to lead a Christian life and be fully prepared and instructed for regeneration whenever it comes. Now, someone might raise a counter-argument and say, well, they also conferred absolution on people hastily, and we know that people can be justified without actual sacramental confession by the desire. But that argument doesn't work. And the reason is that you can go to confession again. There's no real downside, in other words. Pronouncing a general absolution in a hasty way is not as drastic a move as baptizing someone, because once you're baptized, you can never be baptized again. But if someone is absolved, he can always go to confession again, and in fact before he would receive any other sacrament if he were to live through the danger. So that doesn't work. The fact is that even among baptism of desire advocates, they are not even sure about the idea. Obviously they can't be because it's false, and their practice proves that they do not really believe that the desire can save. Now, I want to quote some authorities which enhance this point and also refute a common myth. One of the false arguments that baptism of desire advocates like to make is that the Church has historically caused catechumens outside of danger of death, unbaptized catechumens, to wait long periods of time before baptism. And so they argue that this is the traditional practice of the Church, and this traditional practice of the Church militates against the idea that an unbaptized catechumen cannot be saved without baptism. For how could a good, loving mother have her unbaptized catechumen wait this extended period of time in a state of damnation? Rather, the Church, they argue, if what you're saying is true, would baptize them right away. Well, the first myth we need to shoot down is the idea that this long delay, which arose in some areas, is from apostolic tradition. It is most assuredly not. We can read right in Acts chapter 8 that Philip baptized the eunuch of Queen Candace right away, in the space of one quick visit and instruction. He met him, he quickly instructed him, he made sure he believed, and he baptized him. It's right there in Acts chapter 8. Some describe it as the fastest period of catechetical instruction of all time. But that's what we read the apostles did. That's the apostolic tradition. So this idea that the Church has mandated a long delay is simply not true, and the practice is varied in the early Church. Some places they waited longer, some places they didn't. But the apostolic tradition is for basically no delay, and I frankly believe it's been abused, and there were other abuses in the early Church, like Tertullian recommends not even baptizing people until they grow up, and St. Cyprian and the African bishops would rebaptize those who had been baptized by heretics. So you had traditions in certain areas that arose which were not in accord with the apostolic tradition. The apostolic tradition is not a long delay for catechumens. They must be committed, and that can be demonstrated in a very short period of time. And so the argument that the Church has mandated a long delay and that proves that it's not necessary for them is simply false. And it's further obliterated by Pope St. Siricius in his letter to Hamerius, 385. It's quoted in our book, vaticancatholic.com, and this is devastating to baptism of desire on a number of fronts. He begins his letter by talking about the observance of Paschal time. He's referring to the fact that unbaptized catechumens were frequently baptized at Easter time. He says that should be continued. And he goes on to say that if there's any danger, and those who are, quote, in want of the water of holy baptism be confronted in any necessity, he says that they, quote, must be succored with all possible speed, in other words, baptized, for fear that if those who leave this world should be deprived of the life of the kingdom for having been refused the source of salvation which they desired, this may lead to the ruin of our souls. End quote. He clearly denies the concept of baptism of desire in this letter. He's saying that these unbaptized catechumens in any necessity must be baptized for fear that if they die, they will be deprived of the life of the kingdom for having been refused the source of salvation, meaning baptism, which they desired. So he's saying they desire it, and they're refused the kingdom because they die without it. And he goes on to say, and emphasize the point, if those threatened with shipwreck or the attack of enemies or the uncertainties of a siege, or those put in a hopeless condition due to some bodily sickness, ask for what in their faith is their only help. Let them receive at the very moment of their request the reward of regeneration they beg for. So he says that for these unbaptized catechumens, those who desire it, water baptism is their only help. There is no other way to be saved. So we have a saint, a father, a pope of the church clearly rejecting baptism of desire. And furthermore, his letter clearly proves that the delay outside of danger of death in baptizing unbaptized catechumens was not because it was believed they could be saved without water baptism. And I'll talk more about that in the next part.